Thank you for the very warm welcome, Margaret. We went to the Lutheran Seminary at Philadelphia, not United Lutheran Seminary. I know of no such place, even though that's what my degree said. By the time I walked out of there, I was the first graduating class from United Lutheran Seminary. We both started when it was the Lutheran Seminary at Philadelphia. And it was, as they said at the time, the Harvard of the Lutheran seminary systems. It was where you went to learn the confessions. It's where you went to sit under Gordon Lathrop. It's where you went to go do all the big Lutheran things at the time. And I walked in there completely unaware of any of that stuff. Had no idea. Had only been in the ELCA church for like a year before that. Right down the road in Havertown. I grew up on 62nd and Race in Philadelphia. If you're not familiar with that area, right now the Philadelphia Inquirer is a great podcast. If you subscribe for the month about the move bombings, or if you just Google the move bombings, MOVE, no dots in between. Move has been very clear. It's not an acronym. And so I grew up, in the early 70s, early 80s in Black Philadelphia. I am Black, trans. My pronouns are they, them, theirs. I'm queer. And I grew up with not a lot of that language, right? And I know this always seems a little weird when people self-identify in this way for some folks, but I'm a big believer that what Bell Hooks taught as a pedagogue. If I don't tell you where I'm coming from, I can't get out of the way, right? And that way you can kind of tell what's my stuff and what's really the research that I'm going to share with you tonight, and what's really some of the stuff that I'm into now. But but so I grew up with some stark experiences. I asked my mom why we didn't live with our white family in the much nicer homes like my uncle had, the guy who wrote the first code for the Mac machine. If you're local, you go tap Mac. He worked for IBM. He wrote the first code for that. I was like, they live in Valley Forge. Why don't we live with them? And my mom said, I knew that it was safer for me to learn how to live in Black culture for you two boys than it was for y'all to come and live in white culture. And in 1984, when you lived in West Philadelphia, you did not understand that shit. You're like, it is dangerous around here. It is not great. You know what I mean? My cousins get to roam a whole field on their own. I don't get it. But my mom was pretty radical for her time, right? That she decided that she should be the one who should have to adjust cultures, and I should be raised around people who would question who I was. And my father was dyslexic. We now know he was autistic through my diagnosis. He couldn't read or write. Some of my earliest memories were being taken out of school, second and third grade, to go fill out applications for him around Philadelphia. And I grew up in a kind of a folk Catholic family where, as an example, me and my brother were not baptized until my brother started acting out and I started having dreams that were coming true. And then my my grandmother, whose maiden name was Helen Yanish, thought we might have the zutch on us. And so we went and got baptized, right? And my aunt Gussie, who taught me about the saints, taught me about mostly taught me the saints because I listened and I liked what she did with candles, and I liked how she read the Bible, but she also was doing something else clearly. And she let me hang out because I had the pure heart, so I could go do the lotto. She would hit more when she sent me. She played her numbers. She rubbed Van oil on my ears to make me pray to Mother Mary with her and do the rosaries before I go put in her numbers. So that was my religious education as a kid. It was this sort of hodgepodge. If you'd have met me, I was a very literal, very scientifically driven kind of, analytical. People. My father was a stone cold atheist, so I knew that was an option as a young kid. My dad would always laugh. He's like, "What you gonna do? You gonna go get trapped with the Sky Daddy people?" That's what he would call them as a kid. You gonna go pray to nothing, boy, and get locked in the basement for 3 hours with your grandma? He'd laugh at us when we go with him. And so I kind of grew up in this atmosphere that wasn't contentious, but certainly had many options in front of me, right? Including my very Baptist cousin, who's now an ABC minister in Brooklyn, New York, and studied under Dr. James Cone, and, took this very, very traditional Black, preacher path, right? So I spent a lot of years houseless. I had different encounters with the criminal justice system as a juvenile. And you fast forward a bit, and I am in seminary, and I end up becoming an ordained minister in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. This happens at the seminary. And really, the stuff I want to talk to you about tonight kind of starts there. So I don't know if you were in liturgy class with us, Margaret, but we didn't get Gordon Lathrop, and everyone was very upset that we didn't get Gordo. And we got this little Episcopalian minister. Oh God, his name escapes me right now, and I feel so mad about it, but it'll come to me. And he rode his bike everywhere the way the Wicked Witch of the West rides her bike, and he also was famous for doing that in general. Seminary in New York City, and to give you a taste of what this guy was like, he at the end of class he announced to us, he said, "Congratulations, everyone! You are now food critics at the heavenly banquet. May you never enjoy another meal." Right? This is the kind of person he is. And I started to ask myself certain questions about liturgy at that time. Now, I don't know if you're from a Christian tradition or a Jewish tradition, because really the word liturgy comes from the Jewish tradition. A literal translation from Koine Greek would be public works. I know people like to say work of the people. That's a transliteration. And there's a big difference, right? Like public works doesn't make sense for the context that it was used in that language. So work of the people, right? And I got really obsessed with it. I mean, I started to really realize that in particular, mainline denominations had a liturgy and a beat to them that you could start to subvert and play with. So one of the first things I did in that class was I said, "Hey, is there a Lutheran rite for exorcism? Like, what happens if you meet a demon?" Right? People said, "Well, we don't really have one of those. I mean, our baptism is sort of that." I said, "Well, I mean, yeah, kind of, but like, hasn't there been anyone who's ever done an exorcism, like, ever?" Funny enough, Gordon Lathrop had done one publicly in church a year earlier in front of all of the student body, where a woman came in and they weren't sure if it was a mental health crisis or if it was a drug thing. But the stuff she started saying in Koine Greek and quoting scripture back at Gordon scared him enough that he started to do the rite of baptism to her in the middle of the service. Stops his preaching and all, walks right down the center aisle, walks her up, brings her to the font, starts doing the rite of baptism, right? And she calms down, sits for the rest of the service, then walks out and leaves. Now, who knows what happens in that exchange, right? But I start to study stuff like that. In Greek, there is a specific word that's different than epilepsy and seizures, or what they thought, was the general, that illness. There was a difference between mental illness, and there was a difference between what they called the demonic. And it was a very specific difference when it was used in scripture. And you can really see this play out in the book of Luke. And that really got me thinking about, like, as a historian, this is weird. This is a weird way to go, right? As a historian about this stuff. So I think, well, maybe that's why people didn't listen to Jesus. Maybe he's just another first century sorcerer talking about another God. And it is just a war god that most people know as genociding the original people who were in this valley just a couple hundred years earlier. I was like, and maybe that's maybe a better way to think about Jesus as just someone who's in this marketplace full of people with many gods and many interpretations of gods. And they're all kind of hawking their God, you know? They're all talking about it. One person's like, I worship Baal, and look what Baal does. Or I'm over at Mount Azareth. I'm not here at the temple, you know, or we worship Yahweh this way and look at the miracles we can do. And the Pharisees are doing the same, and everyone's kind of doing the same. You know, there's this sort of marketplace of ontological ideas, and Jesus is just the ontological idea that we ended up with or won out, depending on your perspective. But I put all that aside because it was the middle of Black Lives Matter. I was involved with power. I wrote my first book, Dear Church, which was an attempt to get the evangelical Lutheran Church in America, the widest denomination in America, to be the first to step up to fight what I then called the theological civil war and religious authoritarianism. We now know it as Christo-fascism. I didn't have the language. There were lots of people who wrote about it at the same time as me who claim they had the language now. It'd been back then that they have now. And it's just untrue. There was not a lot of language for what we were experiencing, but there were people definitely on the forefront talking about it at least 5 to 10 years before me. Many of my professors talked about a warping of civil religion, which was a huge thing at my seminary at the time, right? And they were concerned about this warping of civil religion and weaponizing of civil religion. And so with all these thoughts stirring around in my head about liturgy and using the language of the church and using particularly Lutheran liturgical language, I wrote my first book, Dear Church, and I used it in I would say a subversive way to help dismantle white supremacy in a very particular way. And my second work was my story, my book. That's the book that undid me. That was my memoir. United States of Grace. My life has really changed since I finished that book. Then I went out west after launching a church in Brooklyn, New York. I went out west to kind of retire and get away from doing anti-racism work and being the church's poster boy or poster they at the time. And really felt like I was complicit in the work of white supremacy, because as long as the ELCA was able to say, well, we let Lenny do this over here, it was okay. That Dylan Roof was born and raised and bred in our denomination, it was okay. That Minnesota, where there's the hugest stronghold of Lutherans per capita in the country, uprisings keep happening over and over and over and over again. It was okay that George Floyd died there, right? Because I was there and other people were there and we were doing anti-racism work. So we were trying to get better. And it felt hypocritical. And I felt like I was part of the problem. So I went out west to kind of quiet down. I moved out there January of 2020 and then to Portland, Oregon. And then I was in Portland, Oregon I was the on-the-ground chaplain for was effectively Black Lives Matter Portland, which is Justice for Patrick Kimmons at the time. From May 25th, 2020 until 2023, through 3 mass casualty events, death of comrades, open pitched battles, and a real test balloon for like what we're seeing now in the States, if you're here. And, watch the police shoot through a wall of moms to get to the wall of vets, after they tear gassed the clergy out of the way. Like, it was just, and it went on and on, and I watched the 45th president of the United States get suggestions on Fox and Friends in the morning and try them out on us that afternoon. The first time unmarked, ununiformed ICE agents picked a bunch of us clergy up, they drove us all back to our cars. They drove around with Mini 14s like this, no insignia, didn't say anything to us, drove us right back to where we had parked all our cars. so they knew, so like we would know that they knew where we were parked, and they asked us about our kids and stuff, you know, before they dropped us off, right? And so this was all 2020, and New York Times and the WAPO and others covered it, and it all got lost in the Biden administration and the wash of all the noise. But during that time, I experienced what my first like kind of psychedelic or sorceress or weird teacher I had in my life, James Vincent Domenico, called magical twilight. He said it's when everything you think you know about God, you think you know about the universe, you think you know, it all stops working in the light of some either crisis, event, something. And for me, the death of George Floyd, going out there for the first time, you know, with years of de-escalation and chaplain experience and having to wrestle a gun from a protester's hand after he shot another protester, like that was like my first 2 hours out there. Um, the way people looked through the collar like it was nothing. The way the federal agent shot at me, dressed in full cassock, as if it was a better target. Um, the way none of the children respond to the message of a Palestinian man who was murdered by police through a conspiracy of clergy and the state. I knew I had to find something. So for me personally, that meant I went back to my roots. And, you know, we known our first ancestor, Timothy Duncan. He was here from Nigeria for 2 years before he escaped and joined the Poughkeepsie Union unit and fought for his freedom. We know that he was across which is the Niagara unit, where most of the young men who were part of the Underground Railroad, if they joined the unit, that's typically where they ended up. We don't have anything written down by her or anyone else, but that's most likely who he was. He's a very likely candidate. He had no children. He had nothing holding him back. He had no partner. He would have been a candidate for the railroad, and he would have ended up. But we know he ended up in the unit where many of the young men who were part of the Underground Railroad during the Civil War ended up. And we know he was an Oshun, right? Like we carry that lore in our family. If you don't know who Oshun is, she's an Orisha from Western Africa. An Orisha simply is a messenger. But I wanted my roots, and I was in the middle of a war. So I figured I'd go down there to someone and I'd go see an Owo or an Aya, and I'd finally claim my this other side of my family heritage. And so I'd go, you know, maybe I get Ogun or Eshu or Shango. It's the middle of a war. You know, you think you get one of these Orishas who are war Orishas, Orishas that help you communicate, or Orishas that make you a better politician, or Orishas that help you build tools, or an Orisha that opens doors or closes any doors, or Orishas of justice. But I got Oshun, like my ancestor. So in the middle of the war, my best defense was femininity. I started wearing more dresses. I started putting on more makeup. While all the other kids were armed and with full armor, I started wearing body armor and I started wearing coveralls, no body armor, and glitter. And just going out there and talking to them, and they responded. They started showing up at barbecues. They started showing up at the first thing that happened was the entire community defense team brought all their weapons and their armor that they were defending Black people with to the Ogun pot. And we all prayed over them that they never have to fire them. Not once. Right? Bring them to the warrior to talk about peace. In the summertime, when there was so much fracture between the blocks and people were at each other's throats, I started throwing barbecues where they all have to come in, and I had this giant Oshun statue. And by this time, I had built Orisha and Eshu all over the house. I was 3 years into my study, or 2 years into my study. I had already received Ifa. I had already received Ogun. I had already received Oshoshi. I had already received Obatala. I had already received I had already received Usan Mari in a very rare ceremony. I had figured out my egg bay. I was in touch with my guardian ancestors, and I was reading scripture and preaching from a place that I had never preached before about Jesus Christ. And this new book kind of comes from all that. It comes from this period of my life where I wasn't sure how I could protect people. During the death of George Floyd, for the first time ever, 2 Black boys were murdered by police on my parish. Now, I don't know if any of you were pastors or former pastors, but it was my parish this time that them boys were murdered on during that time. And their names were Kevin Peterson and Janelle McDonald. And 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 instead of going there and preaching and like organizing people and calling interfaith folks, show up and I pour honey and milk on the spot where where he was murdered on the blood. Instead of raising the spirit up and having people say his name, I'm trying to send him home. When I found myself moving in the midst of a war in very different ways and in very different modalities than what I had been taught. And in particular, the one thing that Oshun gave me in that first year, because I did my year in white in the middle of the uprising, which if you know anything about this tradition, that's a year where I have to wear white so other people in the tradition can spot me easily on the streets. And I have certain taboos, certain things I can't do. And I'm still an ELCA pastor at the time. They put me on trial for witchcraft twice. I won twice because it's just silly. You can't have Norwegian societies and then say, like, I can't do a thing that's philosophical, cultural, religious, scientific, also linguistic, and part of our oral epistemology. That's part of our cultural heritage that we've carried with us all over the diaspora. How we've communicated. It's whether I'm synchronizing it or not, whether it's saints or not, But yeah, this book that I'm going to read from, that's really where it comes from. It really comes from this place of I needed something of my own, and for some reason, the ontological construct of Jesus Christ. And I wrote about this in Dear Revolutionaries. It was dead. It, you say Jesus Christ, you say I follow Jesus Christ to someone, and they don't know if you mean harm to their trans child. They don't know if you mean that you want to save their soul because you have some weird atonement theology, and you think that like your whole life's purpose is to harass people about their life's purpose. Um, uh, uh, they don't know if you mean that you're a cultural Christian, which just means you like to go start fights at like drag breakfast. Like it, and I realized that there were multiple Jesus Christ running around America, and all of them had almost equal ontological power, weight, and the ability to affect culture. And all 3 or 4 of them, and I'm writing more about them in the later chapters of the book, how they've become almost like psychopomps for our cultural and political division right now. But these multiple Jesuses that I believe are running around America, when you're on the inside, it seems like yours has so much more power and people are listening to you so much more. And in particular, if you're in a progressive mainline tradition, you think a lot of people are listening to you, and they're not. They're just not. You just know a lot of people who are part of your tradition. And that's really hard for people to get, like how much social media has embedded us in not just social media. The fact that there's 7 generations in the pew across traditions right now, and how do you talk to 7 generations at once about one singular problem that's happening in the now, and a lot of other things. But and on the right, it's the same way. I talk to those people, and they believe that they're winning culturally, that their Jesus is the one that's being lifted up, that people can clearly see the glory. Um, so anyway, I'm going to read from this new book, and hopefully y'all like it. It's very, very, very raw. It is going to be published next year by Lellewlyn Worldwide. I'm very happy that Lellewlyn Worldwide picked me up. For me, that was a dream of little Lenny's, to be with the publisher of, everyone from, Aleister Crowley to Scott Cunningham to Raymond Buckland, to actually people we do like. And, no, I'm kidding. But, just it's been the place where esotericism, mysticism, the early, particularly the early spiritualist movement, it's been the publishing house since 1910 for all that stuff. So for me, that's little Lenny. When I went to the weird section of the Philadelphia Public Library, that was the publisher who, gave me everything. And so it was a big deal that I'm going to be with them. That comes out in 2026. It's called Black Power and Black Magic, a reenchantment of the history of the Americas. So I'll just read a little bit from the introduction. And if you can give me a wave if I'm going too far, if people are zoning out, Margaret, that'd be great. All right. Introduction. The future lies behind us. What you have in your hands is the result of decades of persistent curiosity. It is written by someone who has a knack for asking the most unanswerable question at the absolutely most impolite time. This is a history book that attempts to undo the very concept of history making and crafting, and is full of the eerie disquiet that many scholars try to ignore throughout the historical record. This disquiet, this uncontented feeling is hard to describe, but when studying the story of us, what people in the media or the academy, like me, call the subject of historical and cultural studies, one is often left with the idea that something is wrong with history. Even as a temporal and cultural postscript witness, as you grow from student to perhaps a scholar, maybe even a philosopher on the subject, you're left with nothing but stories, framings, ontologies, epistemologies, myths, and legends. You try to pin sometimes a whole century's worth of the mess that is humanity into a word: history. If you're really paying attention, you realize there is an invisible liturgy to the way you are expected to retell history, a beat, an accepted societal rhythm that often has more effect on the story of us than the data. These swings in how society likes to hear the story of us retold in this invisible symphony are often political, ahistorical, and are perhaps easier for me to see as a Black trans queer scholar. I'm going to increase. I think I'm going to make this bigger for myself. There we go. Cool. History has always and will always be one of the most important battlegrounds in the fight for human liberty across space and time. History, of course, in this thought experiment becomes a stand-in for humanity, since it's composed entirely of us, people, our story. That is why throughout this book, I will often call it the collective body of stories of us, or for short, the story of us. So the question then becomes, is something wrong with us? Why can't we seem to learn the lessons of the past collectively about war, pestilence, hatred, and the oppression of the other? Black Power and Black Magic is my attempt to answer these questions. It's an exercise in history crafting, which is the art of ontology creation. Make no mistake, the future requires deep study of history. It is not a passive means of resisting oppression either. It is, in a word, revolutionary. Nor is history a series of facts to know or memorize that have little to no discernible pattern, but a butcher's bill. History can be condensed and repackaged into Aesop-style fables, neatly wrapped up parables to stick in your pocket like a party trick to be used in rhetoric or for cheap and temporary political gain. But none of this is what history crafting really is. It is a field full of just as much wonder as the quantum foundation scientists rave is happening all around. Simply put, historical record keeping, the crafting of historical narrative and required cultural studies to pull off these feats is a world-saving and redeeming enterprise. Which brings us back to our question, what is wrong with history? Or more accurately, what is wrong with us that we don't seem to collectively learn and grow from the lesson history has to offer us? Common example is war. We know the cost of war, death, trauma, cultural groups erased or irreparably harmed, people groups wiped out, the loss of art, the harm to sciences and to the future. We abstract this and conceptualize any war. Even now, you can instantly watch hours of horrific images from around the world. We don't. We watch maps, graphics, B-roll with the death edited out. We know the bloody track record of war across all our cultures, countries, and yet we persist. Why? We know what is happening, war. The answer has always seemed simple to me, though. It's the how we retell the collective colossal story of us. It's the way we tell the story of war that makes war possible around the world today. For another way of thinking of it, it is the framework in which we tell stories, myths, legends, and one-sided accounts that we call history. Eyewitnesses are incredibly unreliable. An event a few days ago, the memory itself is confused mostly of what we think happened. In the hands of a historian like me, it can often have divergent interpretations. History, we are taught, is as concrete as chemistry, mathematics, or even quantum foundation work. But all those sciences are malleable, movable, able to be shaped to consider new or newly available data. But the fields of history and its sibling anthropology in the mind of the average citizen is concrete, in stone. History, by its very definition, is in a word, over. This paradoxical way of approaching history can stifle new perspectives or new approaches to history and historycraft. In this book, this thought experiment we're going to embark on together, we are going to re-enchant history. This, I believe, is the only way to secure a more equitable, just, abolitionist, and decidedly democratic future for the cause of collective human living. Our plan is to rescue the past from its terrible present-day America we have become entangled in. My home, whatever that word means to you, has been and always shall be the United States of America, and I am, for better or worse, an American. So I wanted a different framing, a new beat, rhythm, symphony, or liturgy to what we call the history of the United States to the middle school classrooms across the country. I ended up embarking on a very unexpected trajectory of which you hold the results of now. I decided to tell the story of the United States from the perspective of the magical practitioner. Black power and black magic is the untold story of magic's rather direct impact on the history of the United States and the Americas as a whole. A story that, while largely unexamined by the average citizen, is a story whose impact we still live in today. Untold, unexamined, lampooned, censored, and misunderstood are the more common treatments of the story of magic, esoterica, mysticism, and its adherents here in the Americas. This doesn't change the uncomfortable historical fact that nations have been born from the powerful cultural, political, and magical rights of the oppressed on this continent. Sorcerers, hoodoos, doctors, seers, those touched by the spirit, and traditional medicine workers of all stripes have used those same skills in the cause of abolition, of land back. That people of good conscience have believed that they have had powers divine, eldritch, sorceress, ancestral, and that those same people believe they use these epistemological systems in the cause for human liberation. A new lens that retells the forgotten silence and often queer story of how people have practiced so-called occult, magical, esoteric, mystical, and otherworldly traditions for over 500 years on this continent, one in which everyday esoteric rites and practices collided from all over the world, became interwoven into everyday life of us in such a way that we don't even recognize it. It is everywhere. You probably cast a spell or a charm twice a week without even thinking about it. Admittedly, at the first hint, at first to the uninitiated, pun intended, it's hard to explain the ubiquitousness of esoterica, spiritualism, head witchery, hoodoo, conjure, voodoo, espiritismo, sorcery, and many other almost intact African cosmologies in the story of this continent. The common analogy is a fish looking for water comes to mind, but somehow that isn't enough to explain the strange way the academy, the church, and state have dominated the historical narrative with a particular lens we all sense is deeply lacking. Or even a fish knows when it's gasping for water on the docks. It does feel like America is in the middle of a spiritual gasp. Its lungs bursting at the seams full of hot air. Animals sense death coming. What is the study of the practice of black magic could further the cause of liberation, abolition, and that of freedom, of human freedom generally? And the only price for access to this realm is to believe your ancestors were just as thinking, feeling, and curious as you about the same questions that you wrestle with today. To believe their self-reported narratives as their world, their ontology, their epistemology. Just for a second, think that our ancestors probably understood their world, its politics, its great questions of the day better than we possibly can. For many, in the face of the same systemic, historical, and insurmountable problems we face today, magic was the answer then. In fact, I contend in particular, magic, mysticism, and esotericism was a major force in the cause of Black freedom and is a network of diverse epistemologies in the resistance to white supremacy and a multiplicity of the spiritual and moral frameworks in America that represent a hidden substructure that lies in the mortar and the very foundations of this nation. And I'll read 2 more paragraphs and I'll close it and maybe we'll chat or I'll answer some questions. The Black church represents the most explored historical fruit of Black religious experience in the Americas, but it still is only one part of a much larger spiritual liberation narrative. Abolition, democracy, freedom, human liberty, the right to self-organization, these will be our focus, but many of these causes were bolstered by these brave practitioners of hidden arts I wish to introduce to you. Cosmologies crafted with the scraps and refuse left behind in a socially engineered colonial machine meant to rend them alive. Black magical practices are forged in unique spiritual circumstances and pressures that in turn give them not only utility for us today resisting the heritage of colonialism, but recast an American story in a new light. This is a stolen people on stolen land, a land already chock full of older rites and cosmological stories from the dawn of time. These stolen people and practitioners had to learn to live alongside or tap into the power of land-based practices in a place where the stars didn't even align. Engineered with the wisdom of homelands never forgotten, but never seen again. Ancient poems, songs, and dances that learned to be part of the telling of truths of this new land. Indigenous people and stories that are still being told by the original peoples of this land today. Just like the West African proverb called Ese Ifa verse are told to this day from the Caribbean to Seattle to Peru. Just like the stories of Hermes Trismegistus migrated from Nubia to Egypt to Syria, then Europe. Finally, they come to the Americas. And what are we to make of all this? Are we a great nation founded on the principle of religious liberty? And if we are, then why is the modern interpretation of that simply the tenets of modern Protestantism? Frankly, if the story of the Americas is one of religious freedom, fervor, and values, it is only Christian in the ink of the historian and lips of the so-called winners of colonialism. It can only lay claim to saints, angels, miracles, sacred mothers, and the fountains of youth by the work of the people, the liturgy of our collective and stolen language. It is the people's blood, sweat, tears, curses, little prayers, angel crowns from departed loved ones, crystal gazing, poor Richard's almanacs, hands, Toby's, and mojo bags that have contributed more to the cause of religious and actual freedom than the church's illustrious theologians, except for the ones deemed heretics or communists. We'll stop there first. So that's the new work. And it is like, I'm doing it for Llewellyn, right? So they're like, you gotta put some actual spell works in there, right? So I'm gathering some historical material from actually an Episcopalian priest who put together the most comprehensive conjure and hoodoo spell book in history, which is a whole story I'm going to tell. This guy, man, I'm so jealous of. His name's Harry Hyatt. He married well. He took his wife's name. He married into the Hyatt family. For one thing, that's just smart. You're married into the. I'm a Hyatt too. Babe. I want your name. This is a smart Episcopalian priest, and he starts hearing stories in 1920 as an intern, or 1932 actually. No, 1928 to 1932. He's an intern, and he's a deacon in Chicago in Black poor neighborhoods, and he starts to hear stories coming up from the South about magical practices that are happening. And he starts to compile them, and he's so early. He uses Edison's crystal tubes to get the first. So he's the first person to start just recording people, not writing down what he thought they said or meant. He just records people, and then he had someone transcribe it in the dialect of Black people of the South of the time, and so it's in their words. And there's 26 volumes. It's like 60,000 pages I'm reading through. No one's ever really put it in any order. Harry didn't even bother to put it in order. So, and so I'm going to, use some stuff from that. I'm going to use some other practices. But yeah, if you read Dear Revolutionaries, by the end of that, I started asking questions like, how come only certain people can practice table practices like blessing the bread? I get it. For the sake of good order. Okay, for the sake of good order, you can't have a public church in our name. Boom. But why can't my parishioners do communion at home again? Why aren't they invested with the same power of the Holy Spirit to transform it if it can only happen in community? Especially as a Lutheran priest, Catholics, they can, it's part of their tradition. If a priest wants communion, he could just make it for himself. Nobody even has to be there. But in the Lutheran tradition, someone always has to be present. You can never do it by yourself, right? And so, like, I started thinking about, like, who that really served, especially if you know a lot about the Christian tradition and the Didache and the first documents we have from the 2nd century about liturgy. If you ever read the subsection about pastor, there was only one requirement. They had to have a clear speaking voice. Literally all they wrote. And so like, and so this sort of comes from that and from my experiences during the uprisings and stuff like that. And, I know Margaret has some questions, and I want to take a look at some of the questions in the chat and stop running my mouth about just silly stuff. But that's where the book's going. I'm 8 chapters in, but I'm trying to condense it down, and it's not due till December, come out late 2026. But yeah, that's the new stuff. So Black Power, Black Magic, look out for it. You can check out the Substack where I read about it, which has the same name. Lenny A. Duncan is Black Power and Black Magic. You can subscribe. It's you get everything for free. It's on a reparation system. So like, if you can't afford it, if you're Black, you're queer, you're disabled, and like, or you're like, you're BIPOC or you're LGBTQIA plus, and like you're disabled, you're struggling, you ain't gotta pay. I never paywall anything. But if you can afford it, buy a year subscription and like, helps other people. Check it out.
So grateful for the beauty and strength of your being and your words and your witness to us, and
Thank you.
and this direction in which you're going, which means the world. It really does. I am sure to all of us who are here and to those who are going to watch this afterwards. But this last quote of yours, I've been just popping favorite quotes into the chat as you were speaking. But if you take a look at this last one, when you were speaking about when civilization ceases in any way, whatever, to believe in the report that only poets can make. And that is what you are doing for us now, the poetry of what you're offering us. I'm so grateful for this space and so honored that you are sharing it with us. And my friend, if you would like to ask any questions to Lenny, just give any feedback whatsoever. I will take your words out of the recording so they're not public, but I'm going to keep recording now just because we may want to hear Lenny's responses in the recording. So the floor is open.
I think, what I suggest in the book is that, like, the price for admission is just admitting you might have been wrong about everything, right? And that it sounds like a low cost at first. You're like, well, I could admit that I'm wrong. Like, I'm over 20, maybe, and like, I don't know. It took me 20 years to admit I was like wrong out loud in front of people in a meeting, in a really meaningful way, right? Like, I was totally wrong about that. And my actions caused harm and, that kind of thing, right? But the price for admission, there's really, and I talk about it later because it's based on Walter Benjamin. If you know anything about Walter Benjamin, he was a cultural critic at the fall of the Weimar Republic. And he wrote a thesis on history that is the most dense 5 pages you'll ever read in your life, probably. And so a lot of the book comes from that. And so you have to wonder what he was thinking, right? But at the time, he's queer, I assume, from a lot of his writing. And he's speaking out against the government. And, he sees the rising fascist tide. Like, he assumes he's going to die, actually, right? And really, that's where a lot of his philosophy or his thesis from history starts to come from, right? And so he writes about how if we look back at our past differently, if we change the story, and he starts talking about the idea that history is written by the winners in the much more metaphysical way the original French philosopher meant it. Right. And he starts asking these ideas. If we're historical materialists, we look at the evidence and the evidence says that that's not what happened, that these institutions around us are lying, right? Then it's our job to hold on to the material of that story, right? So that way future generations are imbued with what he called the weak messianic power. Because our coming was looked towards with great hope and expectation. My ancestors looked at my life, not knowing my name, not knowing my future, not knowing the future of the country, things seeming incredibly hopeless for them. But yet they look towards that future with this index of hope that Benjamin talks about. He says there's this temporal index of hope, because we've been imbued with this weak messianic power, because someone in your past was, if you're an abolitionist, that's not by surprise, right? We are a product of our ancestors. If you're queer in your family, people may not talk about them, but that's the auntie in the tree nobody got nothing to say about. That's like the quiet one, right? It's often in our family histories, it's the absence of story where the abolitionist, the revolutionary, the one who stood up, right? Particularly in white families, that's where the total silence is that you do ancestral work and you go back, right? Now, how come no one talks about, like, I'll give you an example. For years, I had this Aunt Sissy and this Uncle Tommy who lived by themselves, and they were related to my grandmother, and they were part of the dirty Orthodox, like Romani, like no one liked them up in the mountains, right? And I just thought they were good Catholics my whole life, a brother and sister living together like that and hanging out. And Uncle Tommy would just hang out with his war buddies. Sometimes he'd fall asleep on his war buddy's chest. What a good Catholic, right? But I can look back at that piece of history and realize those were two queer people who were brother and sister who lived together their whole lives and protected each other and gave the town an ontology and a story and a narrative, right? That made sense for them at the time, right? That's Tommy. He's been shook up from the war. He just hangs out with his war buddies. And that's Sissy. She just hangs out with her two friends that she sews with. And they looked at my life. They took me in for the first couple of years of my life. I spent some time up there in the mountains when I was a little baby, when my parents were in some trouble. And they looked at my life with hope. Maybe they won't have to live with their brother their whole life to hide who they are. Maybe they'll be able to be maybe this kid will be able to be who they are, right? And so that, I think, is the gasp. How we get to catch a breath in the midst of the gasp, right? As we know that this time was looked upon with much hope. We have a weak messianic power that we've been imbued with, that we've used for many things. We've used it to create the most incredible financial market in world history. I don't know if that's a good use of it. We've used it to create one of the most powerful military industrial complexes ever seen, which will most likely, this arsenal, some part of it, no matter what happens to America, will probably lead to our destruction. We've done great, epic, colossal things with this weak messianic power. But I think the other thing that Benjamin talks about is that we have there's a price to that won't be settled cheaply. This hopefulness, and America in particular is on a collision course with history because of so much optimism in the American dream and what it can do and who we would be and how we would finally overcome it and what it meant that Obama was finally president even, you know what I mean? But you can even go even further back, the Clinton, right? You can go even further back to I would say the second Reagan term. America starts making this hopeful turn, even though I'm not really sure what the Reagan administration gave us for that. Right. And so, and a lot of that is the weight of history. This city on the hill that will somehow wipe away the world's sins. That somehow, if we get it together and we learn to live together, that the sins committed to Africa and to indigenous people here and the sin of what was done to poor whites in Europe and how they were trodden upon. Right? They didn't even know what freedom was until they met indigenous people in Quebec. And the first Jesuits who heard about the concept of liberty in the Constitution called it wicked liberty and talked about how it was a sin. I mean, that's how far outside the European mindset it was. They wrote whole treaties about how writing a constitution and being able to govern yourself with just a speaker and the person only ruled them solely by the right of by the consent of the governed. They wrote whole treaties when they first encountered it with the indigenous people of the Americas as why that's the most messed up thing ever. Why the king and law, you know what I mean, and property, all these things that and I write about this later in the book. The anthropological record right now from indigenous scholars is that the only reason we have democracy is because of indigenous scholars like Candia Rock, indigenous scholars and statesmen who put together constitutions that the early French, explorers and early British explorers encountered. And then 15, 20, 30, 40 years later, we see the so-called Enlightenment in France. All right. But it's only after these encounters Where would anyone in 17th century France get the idea for bodily autonomy above and beyond the king? Where would they ever get the idea that each according to their means and their ability? These were not European, they weren't African ideas, right? These were solely indigenous American ideas that they encountered, wrestled with, and then, and this is all part of the historical record. But we don't talk about democracy that way. We talk about Ben Franklin, who I love. We talk about the Federalist Papers, which I love. I read them all the time. Right? That's how we talk about how democracy is born, but it's so untrue. And so this book is kind of getting to that, and I think Benjamin gets to that. What's it mean when it feels like we can't breathe and the world's not working? Benjamin gives hope in that moment. Don't look up what happened to him, but his writing gives hope.
So. Cannot wait to read this one too. But before it comes out, you all can grab Dear Church or Dear Revolutionaries or United States of Grace or Psalms of My People.
Yep, I have been. I've been prolific lately, I think.
Oh, dear friends, thank you for being here. Really grateful, and we're grateful for any support you give to Alignment. It all goes to keeping this space open and to honoraria for our dear presenters. So I love your system for your Substack. Grateful for that, and everyone hop on over there as well. So to you all, and to you, Lenny, much gratitude and deep love. Thank you.
Thank you.